mysteries with no answers. 14. 6-year-old boy Taranjit Singh of Payal, India, claimed to remember his previous life. The boy had been claiming this since he was 2 years old and used to attempt to run away from home. The boy said he was born in Jalandhar district in the past, and his real name was Satnam, and his father's name was Jeet. He said he was a student of class 9 in school at the time of his death. He was returning home when a scooter rider hit him. He received serious injuries to his head and died the following day. The boy's father went to the school in Jalandhar district where they met an old teacher who told him that it was true that a boy named Satnam had died in an accident and that he was the son of Jeet. After a few days, Taranjit's family came to meet with Taranjit. They showed the photographs of her marriage and asked him to recognize himself in his previous birth. He did so immediately. To confirm the incident, a scientist took samples of the writings of both Taranjit and the deceased from the notebooks kept by the family. A basic theory of forensic science that the handwritings of two different individuals cannot be the same was the basis of his investigation. The author revealed that he was amazed to find that the handwriting corresponded almost exactly with that of the deceased. The only difference lay in the muscular coordination of the two writers, as Taranjit Singh was not accustomed to writing. 13. Stefan Michalak claims to have met aliens at Falcon Lake. Michalak was disturbed by a noise, and when he looked up, he spotted two cigar-shaped objects which were red and brilliant as fire. One of the objects stopped in the air, while the other landed on a big rock 160 feet away from it. From the interior opening of the object, some violet light rays were emitted. Suddenly, a door opened, and he could see that the interior of the UFO was very illuminated. He approached some meters and heard some voices coming from inside the ship. Believing that the object was an experimental flying object, he tried to make contact in English. As no answers were given, he tried other languages in vain. Nervous, he walked to the open door and saw a panel and some lights inside the ship. He didn't see anybody, so he waited. Suddenly, the door closed. Despite his surprise, he discovered a colorful glass around the UFO. It was very well conserved with no cracks. He attempted to touch it, but his glove simply melted. Quietly, a metallic box full of holes got off the UFO, what seemed to be a grid-like exhaust vent. A steamy explosion occurred and some kind of gas was expelled in his direction. Immediately, his clothes started to burn. As the object flew after the other one, Michalak was left behind desperately trying to extinguish the fire. 12. During the 9/11 attacks, one woman amazed the world. Edna Clinton was spotted in the gaping hole caused by one of the planes waving for help. How did she get to this spot without causing herself serious damage? Many theorists will tell you of the hoax nature of these awful attacks and often use steel beams and images like this one to prove their theories. The truth is, people died in this tragedy, and images like this should pull out sympathy and empathy for those people and not bring arguments forward founded on unlogical reasoning. The mystery here is we will never know exactly what went through her mind during these final moments before she was seen to jump, so desperate was her plight to survive. 11. In 1899, Tesla developed high-voltage radio transmission equipment in Colorado Springs. Tesla announced that he was receiving an electrical signal which appears to be intelligent. The signal was clearly repeated periodically with such a clear suggestion of number and order. This led him to believe that the signal was extraterrestrial communication with aliens. At first, he assumed they were originating from Mars. Later, he changed that opinion and stated in one of his news conferences that the signal was coming from somewhere else in space. Then in March of 1960, another mysterious satellite was discovered orbiting the Earth. This mystery satellite was in polar orbit, a feat that neither the US nor the Russians were capable of at the time. The Soviet satellites were inclined at a 65-degree angle with the equator. It was calculated that the weight of the object was about 15 tons, which was far too heavy for a rocket of that era. It also traveled twice as fast as any known satellite at the time. The object was sighted and studied by many of the astronomers across the country. This is what Robert L. Johnson, director of the Adler Planetarium, had to say about the object. The object doesn't even have the decency to maintain a regular schedule like any other man-made object we've ever seen. We don't know when to watch for it. It appears some nights, and some nights it doesn't. 10. On March 31st, 1922, 6 inhabitants of a small farmstead situated between the Bavarian towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich, were killed with a pickaxe. A few days prior to the crime, farmer Andreas Gruber told neighbors about discovering footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the forest to the farm, but none leading back. He also spoke about hearing footsteps in the attic and finding an unfamiliar newspaper on the farm. Furthermore, the house keys went missing several days before the murders, but none of this was reported to the police. 6 months earlier, the previous maid had left the farm, claiming that it was haunted. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on the farm on March 31st, only a few hours before her death. The police first suspected the motive to be robbery and interrogated several inhabitants from the surrounding villages, as well as traveling craftsmen and vagrants. The robbery theory was, however, abandoned when a large amount of money was found in the house. It's believed that the perpetrator remained at the farm for several days. Someone had fed the cattle and eaten food in the kitchen. The neighbors had also seen smoke from the chimney during the weekend, and anyone looking for money would have found it. 9. The Solway Firth astronaut is a photograph taken by Jim Templeton of his daughter, and once he got it developed, he noticed an astronaut-looking figure behind her. The trio were picnicking on Burgh Marsh, a local beauty spot overlooking the Solway Firth in Cumbria, North England, and Jim was taking pictures of his 5-year-old daughter. Jim, a local fireman, told the BBC what happened next. "We sat down and I said, 'Now I'll get some photos of you with the new dress on,' never expecting this to happen." This was the extraordinary figure Jim captured on the second of 3 photos he took of his daughter as she sat on the grass. Behind Elizabeth appeared to be nothing less than a spaceman. 8. Fire erupting merely by his presence. The first incident took place in 1982 in a dentist waiting room. Without cause or warning, the comic book Benedetto was reading suddenly caught fire. One morning he was awakened by a fire in his own bed. His pajamas were in flames and the boy suffered severe burns. Benedetto Supino's astonishing and dangerous abilities came to public attention in the early 1980s when he was just 10 years old. Benedetto, of Formia, Italy, could set things afire just by staring at them. More often, his power to start fires was involuntary. A small plastic object held in his uncle's hands began to burn as Benedetto stared at it. Just about everywhere he went, furniture, paper, books, and other items would start to smolder or burn. 7. Hessdalen is a small valley in the central part of Norway. At the end of 1981 and through 1984, residents of the valley became concerned and alarmed about strange, unexplained lights that appeared at many locations throughout the valley. Hundreds of lights were observed. At the peak of activity, there were about 20 reports a week. Project Hessdalen was established in the summer of 1983. A field investigation was carried out between January 21st and February 26, 1984. 53 light observations were made during the investigation. You may read the details in the technical report. There was an additional field investigation in the winter of 1985. However, no phenomena were seen during the period when the instruments were present. Lights are still being observed in the Hessdalen Valley. 6. In 1984, Gunther Stoll, an unemployed food engineer from Anshausen, was suffering from a moderate case of paranoia. Prior to his death, he occasionally spoke to his wife of them, unknown people who supposedly intended to harm him. He mentioned them specifically on the evening of October 25, 1984, before suddenly shouting out, "Now I've got it!" He then wrote the 6 letters YOGTZE on a sheet of paper before instantly crossing them out. Shortly thereafter, Stoll went to his favorite pub in Wilsdorf, where he ordered a beer and fell to the ground, injuring his face. Witnesses stated that he was not under the influence of alcohol and that he suddenly lost consciousness. He awoke and drove away. It's not known what he did in the next 2 hours. At around 1 a.m. on October 26, 1984, he went to Hagerschelbach. There, he talked to a woman and mentioned a horrible incident. Since it was so late at night, the woman advised him to go home. He then left. At approximately 3 a.m., 2 lorry drivers discovered his crashed vehicle in a trench. Both of them testified to having seen an injured person in a white jacket walking near the car. After calling law enforcement, the drivers found the severely injured Gunther Stoll naked in his car. He was conscious and mentioned 4 male persons who had been with him in the car and had, quote, beat him loose. When asked if the men were his friends, Stoll denied it. He died on the way to the hospital. 5. The Dilatov Pass incident happened in 1959. 9 experienced hikers were found dead, scattered across the pass. They had been missing for almost a month after trekking out into the bleak wilderness of the Ural Mountains. The first bodies, frostbitten and frozen stiff, were discovered lying in the snow on flatland near a river a mile from the tent next to the remains of a long burned-out fire. Around 350 yards away lay the corpse of the expedition's leader. Nearby, a search dog sniffed out the remains of 2 more hikers. The bodies were in a line 200 yards apart, as if they had been trying to crawl behind each other back up to the shelter of the tent, but never made it. Another 2 months went by before the rest of the group were found, under 15 feet of snow, in a den they had desperately hollowed out for themselves before succumbing to the cold. Some of the group had broken bones and terrible internal injuries, but strangely no external wounds, not even scratches on the skin. Stranger still, odd bits of their clothing contained higher than normal levels of radiation. 4. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Soder family home burned down. The cause was traced to defective wiring, despite the fact that the Christmas tree lights were still on after the fire started. The oldest 2 sons and daughter and the youngest daughter survived, but the middle 5 children were missing and no trace of their remains were found. Believing that the fire was a cover for the abduction of their children, George and Jenny Soder spent a fortune on detectives to investigate. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny went to get the mail and found an envelope addressed only to her. It was postmarked in Kentucky but had no return address. Inside was a photo of a man in his mid-20s. On its flip side, a cryptic handwritten note read, "Louis Soder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys A90, 132, or 35. She and George couldn't deny the resemblance to their Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire. Once again, they hired a private detective and sent him to Kentucky. They never heard from him again. 3. In the early summer of 1867, just before she turned 17, Caroline contracted tuberculosis and passed away a few short weeks later. Her sister Selma wanted to create a lasting memorial and asked a sculptor to cast a grave in her sister's likeness. The life-size and lifelike sculpture depicts Caroline just as if she fell asleep reading in her own bed. It was soon after Caroline passed away and the flowers on her grave from the funeral were wilting that her sister began to notice that a fresh flower was always on the grave when she visited. Months and then years passed and still no one had discovered who might be leaving the flowers. The cemetery groundskeepers could provide no clue, but perhaps they were sworn to secrecy. 2. A sudden distress signal was received from the ship SS Orang Medan in 1947. It said, "All officers, including the captain, dead, lying in chart room, possibly whole crew dead." And then finally, seconds later, "I died." When the Silver Star crew located and boarded the apparently undamaged Orang Medan in a rescue attempt, the ship was found littered with corpses, including the carcass of a dog. Sprawled on their backs, the faces frozen, and upturned to the sun with mouths gaping open and eyes staring, the dead bodies resembled horrible caricatures, with no survivors and no visible signs of injuries on the dead bodies. A fire then broke out in the ship's number 4 cargo hold, forcing the boarding parties to evacuate the Dutch freighter, thus preventing any further investigation. Soon after, the Orang Medan was observed to explode and sink. 1. Robin Hull often spoke in a language his mother couldn't understand. She contacted a professor of Asian languages who identified the language as a dialect spoken specifically in the northern region of Tibet. Robin said that he went to school many years ago in a monastery, and that is where he learned to speak that language. However, the truth was that Robin wasn't even of school-going age and had yet to set foot in a classroom. The professor investigated further based on Robin's descriptions and eventually settled on a monastery in the Kunlun Mountains that matched the information the young boy was able to relay. Robin's story inspired the professor to actually travel to Tibet, where he located the monastery. Thanks for watching another amazing video, folks. Subscribe for more from Elite Facts.